These are my new billet frame parts that I gonna weld into my frame to reinforce it. This is very needed because of the power of my 3-cylinder engine. If you can see here, if I apply a little pressure here, nothing moves in comparison to the original frame. If I just apply a little pressure, you can see the whole frame is bending, and that's very bad. This part I'm gonna weld here. Those parts are gonna weld it in the rear. This part I'm gonna weld in here. I have to cut out the bridge with a grinder and then I can weld it in here. This part is belonging here. This part I'm gonna weld in here. These parts are my favorite. I have the channel name milled into the aluminum. These parts are gonna be welded in here. Now I'm going to cut out the old swing arm here and at the front and cut out the bridge. Then I'm going to tack weld it in the new frame parts and see how it looks. Here you can see the side-by-side comparison of the two swing arms. When you look closely, this is very thin aluminum, and it doesn't surprise me that this cracks very often. It just takes a little bit of pressure and then it bends. When you compare this to the upgraded swing arm, it doesn't even bend a single millimeter. It's extremely solid. After I cut the old swing arm off, I cleaned the area a little with my grinder so that the new swing arm fits perfectly in here.
To weld aluminum properly, you need to keep a few things in mind. The most important thing is cleaning the components to be welded. Here, for example, I'm cleaning the welding rod with an alcohol cleaner. Then I go all the way to plus with the AC balance so that a ball forms at the front of the welding torch. The fuse in my workshop just blew here. This has happened to me often since I weld with a lot of current. I'm by no means an expert when it comes to welding aluminum. In fact, I've never welded aluminum before. I also not used to TIG welding, as I just bought the welder. Before I started the frame, I watched a lot of tutorials on aluminum and TIG welding. Since aluminum releases heat quickly, but I need a lot of heat to weld it, I heat it with a torch. It's said that about 40 amperes per millimeter of aluminum are needed to weld it in cold condition. Then I use a wire brush to remove any dirt from the aluminum surface. Afterwards, I clean it with an alcohol cleaner. Here I'm turning off an aluminum rod to push it into the frame to reinforce it. Since the reinforcement with the engraved channel name was too thin and simply melted during welding, I had a revised version made. I also had the front seat mounts made. If you're used to weld aluminum and then try welding steel, it's simply heavenly. Everything joins together so easily and it works so much better. Next, I'll paint the seat to protect it from corrosion. This is the first layer, the primer. I know it's absolutely pointless to put that much effort into the paint of a seat, especially because it's covered with a leather, but I'm going to do it anyway. Here I made the mounts for the seat springs. Here I noticed that the welding torch wasn't igniting properly anymore. It got worse and worse until I couldn't weld aluminum at all. It was just burning. I noticed that the head on the welding torch was very loose. Something inside must have broken. So I just bought a new one, and immediately it was able to weld aluminum properly again. Here I am working on the brackets for the rear brake line. Unfortunately, the drilling didn't work as well as I hoped. In the end, they looked like this. The last bracket I'm making here is the one for the steering damper. I initially wanted to mount it on the front of the suspension fork, but I ended up preferring the side mount. The frame is now finished and I can now assemble the bike. If you're wondering where I got all the brackets and reinforcements, I have to say it was a lot of work. Not only for my colleagues who made the parts for me on the CNC milling machine, but also for me, since I had to design all of the parts from scratch. For the first few weeks and months, I just sat in front of the frame and measured everything. At the same time, I designed the reinforcement parts in my head until I was happy with the design. Then I drew all the plans. And at the same time, I checked everything over and over again to make sure the dimensions were correct. Afterward, I gave all the plans to my colleague who designed it in a CAD program. We then adjusted all the design where necessary. Then he milled all the parts for me, and finally, when he was finished, he gave me everything. In total, it took about 8 months of work to get the frame to the look the way it does. I know the welds don't look great, but this was my first time welding aluminum. So I would be very grateful if you liked the video, share it, subscribe to my channel and hit the bell. See you next time.